When I left home at 18, my father told me not to come back. He kept that promise for 11 years right up until the day his lawyer contacted me asking for money. My name is Charlotte Williams. I'm 29, I live in Phoenix now, and for most of my adult life I've told people I don't really have a family. Not in a dramatic way. Just factually. It was easier than explaining the truth, and honestly, most people don't ask follow-up questions if you say it casually enough. But I did have a family once. A very loud one. A very close one, at least on the surface. The kind of family that looks solid from the outside because nobody ever talks about what's actually happening inside the walls. We lived in Mesa, in a sun-bleached neighborhood where every house looked like a slightly more tired version of the one next to it. My dad, Richard Williams, owned a small roofing company that had done well when I was a kid and then slowly stopped doing well while nobody admitted it out loud. My mom, Denise, handled the phones, the invoices, and most of the worrying. My younger brother, Ezra, followed my dad around like a shadow from the time he could hold a hammer. I was the odd one out. Not rebellious exactly. Just not interested in roofing or trucks or the idea that my entire future should revolve around keeping something alive that was already clearly dying. I liked school. I liked structure. I liked the idea that if you worked hard enough at something, you could end up somewhere new. Arizona State University was 20 minutes away, but to my parents it might as well have been another country. When my acceptance letter came, I sat at the kitchen table staring at it for almost an hour before I showed anyone. I kept waiting for the excitement to kick in, but mostly I felt dread. Because I already knew how this was going to go. My mom read the letter twice, lips pressed thin, then slid it back across the table like it was something fragile she didn't want to touch too long. So, she said carefully, "You're really serious about this." "I've been serious," I said. My dad didn't even look up from the bills spread in front of him. "We need you here," he said flatly. "The business can't run itself." It wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict. Over the next few weeks, every discussion circled back to the same place. My dad talking about loyalty. My mom talking about family sacrifice. Ezra watching everything in silence, eyes moving between us like he was trying to predict where the explosion would land. "You can take classes later," my mom kept saying. Plenty of people do. Later meant never. We all knew that. One night, after another argument that started about tuition and ended about everything else, my dad finally said the thing he'd been hinting at for months. "If you walk out on this family to chase some office job," he said, still not looking directly at me, "don't expect to come back when it doesn't work out." The room went very still. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause. I remember thinking, he doesn't actually mean that. He's just trying to scare me. "Dad," I said quietly, "it's not about abandoning anyone. I just want my own life." He leaned back in his chair then, finally meeting my eyes, and whatever hope I had left drained out immediately. There was no anger there. No sadness. Just a kind of hard, settled certainty. "You make your choices," he said. "And you live with them." My mom didn't argue. She didn't soften it. She just nodded like this was reasonable, like this was what loving parents did when their child disappointed them. Ezra stared at the table. I went in my room and cried as quietly as I could, because even then I felt embarrassed for still wanting them to care. The week after my 18th birthday, I packed everything I owned into 2 duffel bags and 1 cracked plastic storage bin. Not because I was ready, but because staying had started to feel like suffocating slowly. The morning I left was painfully normal. Bright sun, birds yelling from the power lines, my mom wiping down already clean counters like she needed something to do with her hands. No dramatic fight. No last-minute reconciliation. My dad carried my bin to the front yard and set it down next to the driveway. Not gently, not roughly. Just efficiently. Like he was moving tools. I stood there waiting for something. A hug. A warning. Call us when you get there. Anything. Instead, he said, "You made your choice." My mom crossed her arms and looked past me toward the street, like she couldn't even watch. Ezra hovered in the doorway behind them. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again. I don't know what he was going to say. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times, trying to imagine it. I loaded my things into my car with shaking hands. The trunk wouldn't close at first because the bin was too big, so I had to rearrange everything while they watched in silence. It felt weirdly humiliating, like I was failing at leaving. When I finally got in the driver's seat, I kept expecting someone to knock on the window and tell me to stop being stupid. That this was all just a bluff that had gone too far. No one moved. I drove away with my entire life rattling around behind me and no idea where I was actually going to sleep that night. For the first few days, I told myself they just needed time to cool off. That once they realized I was serious, they'd call. Maybe my mom would cry. Maybe my dad would pretend nothing happened. We'd all reset. I called them 3 times that first week. Straight to voicemail. By the second week, the numbers didn't work anymore. Disconnected. I tried Ezra next. It rang once, then went silent. Later I realized he'd blocked me. It's strange how quickly a person can vanish from a family's reality. No announcement. No funeral. Just absence. Like you were erased from a group photo. College started, life got busy, survival took over. I slept on a friend's floor for a month before finding a tiny apartment I could barely afford. I worked mornings at a bagel shop, afternoons in class, evenings filing paperwork at a car dealership. Some nights I got home so tired I didn't even bother turning on the lights before collapsing onto the mattress. There were moments when I wanted to call someone, anyone, and say I couldn't do this alone. But there was no one to call. So I stopped wanting to. Something in my brain rewired that year. I stopped expecting comfort. Stopped imagining safety nets. If something went wrong, the solution wasn't help, it was endurance. I watched other students go home for holidays, complain about their parents, roll their eyes at family group texts. They had no idea how lucky they were. I used to pretend I preferred staying on campus, that I loved the quiet. The truth was I couldn't stand sitting in a room full of people with somewhere to go. Connor Blake, a guy from one of my classes, figured it out eventually. He was an EMT who worked night shifts and had the kind of blunt kindness that didn't ask permission. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said once, handing me a takeout container I hadn't asked for. "If you need a place to crash over break, my couch exists." I almost cried right there in his kitchen. Not because of the couch, but because someone had offered without making it a big deal. I took him up on it. Slept under a thin blanket in his living room while he came and went at odd hours, boots thudding softly across the floor. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt safe. Neutral. Temporary in a way that didn't hurt. Years blurred together after that. Classes, jobs, internships, cheap apartments with peeling paint and unreliable air conditioning. I got good at living small. At needing very little. At pretending loneliness was independence. Somewhere along the way, the anger faded. Not because I forgave them, but because anger requires energy, and I needed all of mine just to keep moving forward. By the time I graduated, my parents felt less like people and more like a story that happened to someone else. I built a career in corporate compliance, not glamorous, not exciting, but stable. Predictable. The kind of job where rules make sense and outcomes are documented. I worked hard, kept my head down, saved obsessively. Stability became my version of happiness. Angela Morris, my boss at the time, noticed before I did that I was burning myself out. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone here," she told me during a performance review. "You're allowed to just exist." I didn't know how to explain that existing had never felt like an option before. Eventually, I bought a townhouse on the outskirts of Phoenix. Nothing fancy. Beige walls, tiny backyard, a garage that smelled faintly like new paint and dust. The first night I slept there, I kept waking up, disoriented by the silence. No arguments through thin walls. No footsteps overhead. No fear that someone would decide I didn't belong there anymore. For the first time in my life, I had a place no one could take away from me. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I mostly felt cautious. Like happiness was something that might disappear if I relaxed too much. I didn't talk about my family. Not to coworkers, not to friends, not even to Tyler, the guy I dated for almost 2 years before he finally admitted he felt like he was dating someone behind glass. "You never lean on me," he said during our last conversation. "It's like you don't believe I'll still be here if you do." I didn't have an argument for that. He wasn't wrong. After he left, I sat in my living room staring at the blank wall where his bookshelf used to be and realized I didn't feel heartbroken. Just tired. Like I'd been holding a position for too long and my muscles had locked into place. Life settled into something quiet. Work, groceries, occasional dinners with colleagues, weekends spent reorganizing closets that were already organized. Not exciting, but safe. Controlled. My parents didn't exist in that life. Not as memories, not as possibilities. Just blank space. Until the day the envelope arrived. It was thick, official, with my name typed in a font that meant business. I assumed it was something boring, insurance paperwork, HOA nonsense, maybe tax documents. I tossed it on the counter and made coffee before opening it. Inside was a formal letter from a law office in Mesa. I didn't recognize the firm's name, but I recognized the names of the clients immediately. Richard Williams. Denise Williams. My hands went cold. For a moment, I genuinely thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe a different family with the same last name. Maybe a clerical error. Then I read the first sentence. "Our office represents your parents in a matter regarding financial support and reimbursement for essential living expenses." I had to sit down because my knees suddenly didn't feel reliable. They hadn't called. Hadn't written. Hadn't tried to reconnect in any human way. They had hired a lawyer. The letter went on to explain that my parents were facing serious financial hardship due to medical issues and business failure, and that as their adult child with significant financial capacity, I had a legal and moral obligation to assist them. Legal and moral. Those words felt like they were written in acid. I kept rereading the part that said your parents, like repetition might make it make sense. Like the last 11 years of silence had just been a long misunderstanding. At the bottom was a request, not a polite one, that I contact their office within 14 days to discuss arrangements. If I did not respond, they would pursue formal legal action. I sat there at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at that paper while my coffee went cold beside me. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I did. My father had told me not to come back. He had kept that promise perfectly, right up until the moment they needed something. And suddenly, after more than a decade of being nobody to them, I was their daughter again. Or at least, their responsibility to collect from. I didn't sleep the night after that letter arrived. Not even a little. I kept pacing between the kitchen and the living room, reading the same paragraphs over and over like maybe a hidden sentence would appear if I stared long enough. By 3 in the morning, the house felt too quiet, like the silence itself was pressing in on me. I turned on the TV just for noise, then turned it off again because it made everything feel even more unreal. Eventually, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch, the letter spread out in front of me like evidence from a crime scene. Because that's what it felt like. Not a family issue. Not a reconciliation attempt. A demand. At work the next day, I couldn't focus on anything. Emails blurred together. Meetings passed without me remembering a single word. Angela had moved to another department years ago, so no one there knew me well enough to ask what was wrong, just well enough to notice I was off. Around lunchtime, I gave up pretending and walked outside into the dry Arizona heat. It hit me like opening an oven, sharp and suffocating. Normally I hated it. That day I welcomed it. At least it was something physical. I called the number on the letter before I could talk myself out of it. A receptionist answered, cheerful and professional, like this was just another Tuesday. Law offices of James and Associates. How may I direct your call? My mouth went dry. I received a letter regarding Richard and Denise Williams. Of course, she said immediately. One moment while I connect you to Ms. James. Of course. Like this was routine. Like adult children being summoned to financially support estranged parents happened every day. The hold music was unbearably calm. Soft piano notes that made me want to throw the phone across the parking lot. Then a woman's voice came on, crisp, controlled, the kind of voice that never wasted a syllable. This is Margaret James. I forced myself to breathe. My name is Charlotte Williams. I received your letter. Yes, Ms. Williams. Thank you for returning our call. No warmth. No hostility. Just pure professionalism. Your parents are experiencing significant financial distress due to ongoing medical expenses and the closure of their business. We're hoping to resolve this matter cooperatively. Cooperatively? You mean financially, I said. A brief pause. Ultimately, yes. Something cold slid into place inside my chest. I haven't spoken to them in 11 years. That is unfortunate, she said, in a tone that suggested it was also irrelevant. However, familial responsibility statutes do not depend on the quality of the relationship. Statutes. Not feelings. Not history. Are they asking for money or are they suing me? I asked. At this stage, we are requesting voluntary support. If that cannot be arranged, legal remedies may be pursued. So both. My free hand had curled into a fist so tight my nails were digging into my palm. Did they tell you they kicked me out when I was 18? Another pause, slightly longer this time. I have been informed there was a disagreement regarding your departure from the home. A disagreement. I let out a short, humorless laugh. That's one way to describe it. I understand this is emotionally difficult, she said, though she didn't sound like she understood at all. But the priority is ensuring your parents' basic needs are met. Basic needs. The phrase echoed in my head. Rent. Food. Medical care. Things I had figured out on my own at 18 while they were busy pretending I didn't exist. I need time, I said finally. Of course. However, please be aware that delay may limit your options. The call ended with polite goodbyes that felt grotesque, like thanking someone for threatening you in a very organized way. I sat in my car afterward with the engine off, the air inside turning heavy and stale. For a moment I had the strange urge to drive to Mesa immediately, to show up at the house unannounced and demand they say all of this to my face. But I knew I wouldn't. Not because I was scared of them. Because I wasn't sure I could handle seeing them at all. That night, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Connor answered on the second ring. Charlotte? Everything okay? His voice alone almost broke me. Connor had been there during the worst years, the couch, the late-night grocery runs, the quiet understanding that didn't require explanations. Do you know anything about laws that make you support your parents? I asked. Silence. Then, that sounds ominous. I told him. Not everything, not the full emotional backstory, just the facts. Letter. Lawyer. Sick father. Money. He swore under his breath. That's messed up. Apparently it's legal. Legal doesn't mean right. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel. What am I supposed to do? Connor didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was softer. What do you want to do? I don't know. The words came out smaller than I intended. If I help them, it feels like everything they did was fine. Like they were justified. And if you don't? I pictured the house in Mesa. The sagging fence. My dad coughing into his sleeve. My mom pacing, talking about bills. Ezra looking more tired than anyone our age should. They could lose everything, I said quietly. Connor exhaled. You shouldn't have to fix their lives, Charlotte. Especially after they threw you out. I know. I pressed my fingers into my eyes until stars burst behind them. I just don't know if I can live with not fixing it. That was the problem. Not love. Not loyalty. Guilt. Heavy and shapeless and impossible to set down. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and started searching. Familial responsibility laws. Adult child support cases. Legal precedents. Horror stories. The internet was full of them. Stories about estranged children ordered to pay for nursing homes. About families torn apart in courtrooms. About judges deciding what obligation meant when relationships had already been destroyed. One article mentioned Arizona had statutes that were rarely enforced, but still valid. Rarely enforced didn't mean never. By midnight, my chest felt tight enough that I couldn't take a full breath. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dim glow of the kitchen light, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. I realized something then that scared me more than the lawsuit. They had found a way back into my life without ever apologizing. Without ever acknowledging what they'd done. Without offering anything except need. And the worst part? It was working. Because no matter how angry I was, no matter how distant I had become, I was still sitting there at midnight researching how to help the people who had erased me. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. This one thicker, heavier. Certified mail. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. Inside was a formal notice of intent to file a claim if voluntary support was not established within a specified time frame. Legal language wrapped around the same simple message: pay, or we will make you pay. There was also something new. Medical documentation. Doctor reports. Hospital summaries. Medication lists. Words like chronic, progressive, severe. Seeing my father reduced to paperwork felt surreal. This was the man who used to carry entire ladders on his shoulder, who could tear off a roof in the middle of July heat without slowing down. Now he existed as oxygen levels and prescription dosages. Tucked behind the medical records was a short handwritten note. Not from my father. From my mother. We didn't want it to come to this. Please don't make it harder than it has to be. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just another instruction. My hands started shaking so badly the papers rattled against each other. I realized then that ignoring them wasn't going to make this go away. Silence had been their weapon for years. Now it was mine, and it wasn't working. I needed someone on my side who understood the rules of this game. That's how I ended up sitting in a glass-walled office 3 days later, across from a man named Mateo Alvarez, trying to explain my entire family history without sounding like I was overreacting. He listened without interrupting, fingers steepled under his chin, eyes sharp but not unkind. When I finished, the room felt too quiet again. Finally he said, "First, I'm sorry you're dealing with this." It was such a simple sentence, but it hit harder than anything else had so far. Second, he continued, "You were right to come in before responding further. From this point on, you shouldn't communicate with them or their attorney directly." "Are they actually going to win?" I asked. Mateo leaned back slightly, considering. "It's not a guaranteed case. But it's also not baseless. If they can demonstrate need and your ability to provide support, the court may order some form of assistance." My stomach twisted. Even if they kicked me out? "Estrangement can be a factor," he said carefully. "But it doesn't automatically eliminate responsibility." Responsibility. The word felt like a chain being fastened around my ankle. "So what happens now?" I asked. Mateo slid a legal pad toward me. "Now we prepare. And we find out exactly what they're claiming and what they're not telling us." I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment everything shifted from emotional nightmare to something colder. Because once lawyers got involved, the past stopped being memories. It became evidence. Once Mateo got involved, everything started moving faster than I was emotionally prepared for. Up until that point, the situation had felt unreal, like something happening on paper instead of in my actual life. Legal documents, official language, polite threats. Abstract. That illusion disappeared the day I had to sign a stack of forms authorizing him to dig into my entire financial history. Bank accounts. Salary records. Property ownership. Investments. Debt. Assets. Everything. "I know it feels invasive," Mateo said, sliding the papers toward me. "But if they're claiming you have the capacity to support them, we need to understand exactly what that capacity looks like." I stared at the forms. It felt like handing over proof that I had survived without them. Proof that they had failed to destroy me completely. "They don't deserve to know any of this," I said quietly. "They'll find out anyway," he replied. "Better that we control the narrative." Control. That was something I understood. I signed. After that, the requests started going both ways. Mateo filed for full financial disclosure from my parents: income, assets, debts, medical expenses, business records. Everything they were using to justify coming after me. "That's fair?" I asked. "It's required," he said. "If they're asking for support, they have to demonstrate genuine need." For the first time since the letter arrived, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't panic. Not relief exactly. Just balance. Like the scales weren't completely tilted anymore. That lasted about 5 days. Then Mateo called me late on a Thursday afternoon. His voice had that careful tone again, the one that meant something unpleasant was coming. "Charlotte, I've received their initial disclosures," he said. "We need to go over them in person." My stomach tightened immediately. "Is it bad?" "It's complicated." I drove to his office straight from work, barely remembering the route afterward. The sun was setting, turning the glass buildings orange and gold, but I didn't notice anything except the pounding in my ears. Mateo's office lights were dimmer than usual, the city glowing behind him through the windows. A thick folder sat on his desk. He didn't slide it to me right away. "Before we go through this," he said, "I want you to understand that what's in here may be upsetting." My throat went dry. More upsetting than being sued by my parents? He didn't smile. I braced myself. He opened the folder and began pulling out documents, tax returns, medical bills, bank statements, business filings. Numbers blurred together, columns of red ink, overdue notices stamped across pages. "They're in serious financial trouble," he said. "The business closed 3 years ago. Your father hasn't worked consistently since then." 3 years. That meant this wasn't sudden. This had been building for a long time. "Medical expenses?" I asked. "Significant. Your father's condition limits his ability to work, and your mother's income is minimal." I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. Not sympathy exactly. More like the distant recognition of something sad happening to strangers. Then Mateo pulled out another document and hesitated. "This," he said slowly, "is where things get more complicated." It was a list. Pages and pages of accounts. Credit lines. Loans. My name was on every single one. At first I thought I was misunderstanding. Maybe it was some shared account from when I was younger. Maybe paperwork errors. "I don't recognize these," I said. Mateo watched me carefully. "Look at the opening dates." I did. Most of them were from when I was 16, 17. A few right after I turned 18. A cold, creeping realization began to spread through me. That's not possible," I said. "I didn't open anything. I didn't even have a job back then." "I know." He let the silence sit for a moment, like he was giving me space to reach the conclusion on my own. "They used my identity," I whispered. Mateo nodded once. "It appears so." The room tilted slightly. I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. Credit cards. Personal loans. Equipment financing. Lines of credit tied to the roofing business. Tens of thousands of dollars moving through accounts I had never seen, never authorized, never benefited from. "When I was a minor," I said slowly. "Yes." My brain kept trying to reject it, like this was too extreme to be real. "Parents didn't do this. Not normal ones. Not even bad ones." "Why didn't I know?" I asked. "Many of these accounts defaulted years ago," Mateo explained. "Some were charged off, some settled. It's possible they used your address or intercepted statements. If your credit wasn't checked closely later, it could go unnoticed." Unnoticed. Like a quiet crime buried under time. "So they were drowning financially," I said, my voice sounding thin, "and instead of telling me, they put it on me." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. A memory surfaced without warning, my mom asking for my social security number when I was in high school, saying it was for insurance paperwork. My dad bringing home forms and telling me to sign so the accountant can file everything properly. I had signed. Of course I had. You don't expect your parents to weaponize your trust. My hands started shaking so badly I had to press them flat on the desk. "They ruined my credit before I even had a life," I said. Mateo leaned forward slightly. "Charlotte, I want you to understand something important. What they did may actually strengthen your defense." I looked up at him, stunned. "How?" "If we can demonstrate financial exploitation, the court may view their claim very differently." Financial exploitation. Such a clean, clinical phrase for something that felt deeply personal and dirty. I let out a shaky breath that turned into something halfway between a laugh and a sob. "So the fact that they screwed me over is helpful?" "In a legal sense, yes." I pressed my fingers to my temples. My head was pounding now, thoughts colliding faster than I could sort them. All those years I had blamed myself for struggling so much. For bad credit, for high interest rates, for doors quietly closing that I didn't understand at the time. I had assumed it was just part of being poor and alone. It wasn't. They had handicapped me before the race even started. "I want to be very clear," Mateo continued gently. "None of this obligates you to forgive them. It simply informs how we approach the case." Forgiveness hadn't even crossed my mind. All I felt was this sick, heavy anger spreading through my chest, hot and unfamiliar after years of numbness. "They didn't just abandon me," I said slowly. "They used me first." The words hung in the air between us. Mateo nodded. "That's one way to interpret it." I sat back in the chair, suddenly exhausted, like something inside me had collapsed. All this time, I thought the worst thing they did was kick me out. Now it felt like that had just been the final step. Because once the business stopped being salvageable, so did I. And somehow, even after all that, they still expected me to save them. Mateo moved quickly after that meeting. Within days, he filed motions challenging their claim, requesting additional documentation, and formally introducing the issue of identity misuse into the case. Every email he copied me on sounded calm and professional, which somehow made the situation feel even more surreal. Meanwhile, my life outside the lawsuit kept going like nothing had changed. I still woke up at 6. Still drove to work. Still answered emails about compliance policies and audit deadlines. It felt like living two separate lives, one where I was a competent adult with a stable career, and another where I was an 18-year-old again, standing in a driveway with nowhere to go. The first time I had to return to Mesa was for a preliminary hearing. I hadn't been back in 11 years. The drive itself was only about half an hour from my townhouse, but it felt longer. Every exit sign looked familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. Restaurants we used to go to. Gas stations my dad swore were cheaper. A strip mall where my mom dragged us for school clothes every August. By the time I turned onto the road leading into their neighborhood, my hands were damp on the steering wheel. Nothing had changed. That was the worst part. Same sun-bleached houses. Same patchy lawns. Same quiet that felt less peaceful and more watchful, like the street itself was holding its breath. Their house came into view at the end of the block. Smaller than I remembered. Faded paint. The roof, ironically, looked like it needed repair. A dented sedan sat in the driveway where my dad's company trucks used to be lined up. I parked across the street and just sat there for a moment, heart pounding so hard it hurt. I hadn't planned to stop. I was early for court and thought maybe seeing the house from a distance would. I don't know. Prepare me. Give me closure. Something. Instead it felt like pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurt. A curtain shifted in the front window. I froze. For a second, I considered ducking down like a kid hiding from a teacher, which was ridiculous because I was a grown woman sitting in a perfectly legal parking spot. But the instinct was still there, that old reflex to avoid confrontation at any cost. The curtain fell back into place. I started the car immediately and drove away before anyone could come outside. The courthouse was cold in that aggressively air-conditioned way that makes you wish you'd brought a jacket even in the middle of summer. Mateo met me near the entrance, holding a folder and a paper cup of coffee. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Fine," I said automatically. He gave me a look that suggested he didn't believe me but wasn't going to push. Inside the courtroom, everything felt smaller than it does on TV. Lower ceilings. Fluorescent lights. Rows of uncomfortable benches. A seal on the wall that seemed to watch everything without caring. And then I saw them. My parents were sitting at the front, next to a woman I assumed was Margaret James. My mother looked older, thinner, her hair more gray than I remembered. My father looked small. That was the only word for it. Shrunk somehow, shoulders rounded, skin pale against the collar of his shirt. For a split second, something like grief punched through my chest. Then my mom turned her head and saw me. Her expression didn't soften, didn't brighten. It tightened, like she'd just spotted a problem she'd been hoping wouldn't show up. She leaned toward my dad and said something. He didn't turn around. Mateo guided me to seats behind them, creating a physical barrier between us that I hadn't realized I needed until that moment. "Remember," he murmured, "you don't have to engage with them directly." I nodded, staring at the back of my mother's head. The same posture. The same rigid shoulders. It was eerie how little she'd changed in ways that mattered. When the judge entered, everyone stood. Formalities happened. Case numbers were called. It felt procedural, almost boring, until our names were announced. Williams versus Williams. Hearing it said out loud made my stomach drop. Margaret James stood first, presenting their situation in smooth, practiced language. Medical hardship. Loss of income. Good faith attempts to resolve the matter privately. Adult child with substantial financial means. Not once did she mention that I had been kicked out. Not once did she mention the debt in my name. It was like those parts of the story simply didn't exist. Mateo responded calmly, outlining concerns about estrangement and financial misconduct. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't get emotional. Just laid out facts like building blocks. Then the judge, a gray-haired man with tired eyes, Judge Leonard Bishop, according to the plaque, looked directly at my parents. "Have you had contact with your daughter in the past decade?" he asked. My mom answered before my dad could. "We attempted to reach out several times." My chest tightened. Attempted? When? She chose not to respond, she continued, voice trembling just enough to sound vulnerable. I felt something hot flash through me, anger mixed with disbelief. They had erased me for years, and now I was the one who chose distance? Mateo touched my sleeve lightly, a silent reminder to stay still. The judge made a note. And the circumstances of her departure from the home? Another pause. My mom glanced at Margaret James, who gave a small nod. There was a disagreement about her future, my mother said carefully. She decided to leave. Decided. Not forced. Not threatened. Just decided. I stared at the back of her head, my hands clenched in my lap, nails digging into my palms hard enough to hurt. The physical pain was grounding. It kept me from standing up and shouting that she was lying. My dad still hadn't turned around. He sat there staring straight ahead, hands folded like he was waiting for a bus. The judge nodded slowly, expression unreadable. "This matter will require further examination," he said. "Financial disclosures will be reviewed, and we will reconvene once discovery is complete." Gavel down. Case continued. Just like that. As people started filing out, my heart rate spiked again. I didn't want to pass them. Didn't want to hear their voices. Didn't want them to hear mine. Mateo stood, gathering his papers deliberately slowly, letting the crowd thin first. When we finally stepped into the aisle, my mother turned. For the first time in 11 years, I was face to face with her. Up close, she looked smaller. Not just physically. The force she used to radiate the certainty, the authority, seemed diluted somehow. But her eyes were exactly the same. Sharp. Assessing. Looking for weaknesses. "Charlotte," she said, like we'd run into each other at a grocery store. No hug. No apology. Not even surprise. "Denise," I replied, because I couldn't bring myself to say Mom. Her mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your father would like to speak with you," she said. My dad finally looked at me then. His eyes were watery, his skin sallow, but there was still that familiar stubborn set to his jaw. I waited for something: remorse, warmth, anything human. What I saw instead was expectation. Like this was overdue business, not a reunion. Mateo stepped slightly closer to me. "My client is not prepared for direct discussion at this time." My mother's gaze snapped to him, irritation flickering across her face. "This is a family matter." "It is also a legal one," he replied evenly. My dad cleared his throat, a rough, wheezing sound that made my chest tighten despite everything. "Charlotte," he said, voice weaker than I remembered, but still unmistakably his. "We didn't want it to come to this." I almost laughed. The same line from the note. "Then why did it?" I asked before I could stop myself. He hesitated. My mother answered instead. "Because you left us no choice." There it was. No apology. No accountability. Just the same narrative repackaged for a courtroom. Something inside me went very quiet. Mateo gently guided me toward the exit, and I didn't resist. My legs felt oddly numb, like I was walking on autopilot. Behind us, I heard my mother say my name again, sharper this time, but I didn't turn around. Outside, the sunlight was blinding after the dim courtroom. The heat wrapped around me like a physical force, thick and suffocating. I made it all the way to the car before my hands started shaking uncontrollably. Mateo waited until I sat down before speaking. "You handled that well." I let out a hollow laugh. "I didn't do anything." "Exactly." I gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing. My father's face kept flashing in my mind, smaller, weaker, but still him. Still the man who had watched me drive away without stopping me. "They really believe this," I said quietly. "That I owe them." Mateo didn't answer immediately. "Belief and strategy aren't always the same thing," he said finally. I turned to him. "What does that mean?" "It means we continue preparing. Because this is far from over." As he walked back toward his own car, I sat there alone in the driver's seat, the courthouse looming behind me like something permanent and unavoidable. Seeing them hadn't given me closure. If anything, it made everything worse. Because they weren't monsters. They weren't strangers. They were just my parents. And they were perfectly willing to burn whatever was left of us to the ground if that's what it took to survive. I thought seeing them in court would be the hardest part. It wasn't. The hardest part was what came after, when everything turned quiet again, and I was left alone with the realization that this wasn't a single confrontation. It was going to be a slow dismantling of my entire past, piece by piece, in front of strangers. Discovery started a week later. Before this, the word discovery sounded neutral. Almost academic. Like something you'd do in a lab. In reality, it meant both sides digging through every corner of each other's lives looking for ammunition. Mateo warned me it would feel invasive. He wasn't exaggerating. I had to provide years of bank statements, tax returns, employment contracts, property records, even retirement account summaries. It felt like dumping my entire adult life onto a table for inspection. "These are people who didn't want to know anything about me for 11 years, I said at one point, flipping through a stack of documents. "Now they get to see everything?" Mateo nodded. "Unfortunately, yes. But it goes both ways." The first batch of their disclosures arrived in 2 cardboard boxes that looked heavier than they should have been. Mateo had them delivered to his office, and I came in after work to go through them together. He had already sorted everything into neat piles: financial records, medical files, business documents, personal statements. Even organized, it was overwhelming. "Take your time," he said, sliding a chair next to the desk. I started with the medical records because they felt the least personal. Clinical language. Test results. Charts. Words like chronic, advanced, irreversible. My father's condition was worse than I had imagined. Lung function declining year by year. Hospitalizations. Oxygen therapy recommended, but apparently not consistently used. I felt a dull ache in my chest reading it. Not sharp grief. Just a heavy awareness that time had moved on without me there to witness it. "He used to carry entire bundles of shingles up ladders," I said quietly, not sure why I said it out loud. Mateo didn't respond, just let me keep reading. Next came financial statements. Those were easier emotionally, harder intellectually. Pages of numbers showing income that dwindled to almost nothing, accounts drained down to bare minimums, retirement funds tapped early with penalties. The roofing business officially closed 3 years ago, but the decline started long before that. Missed payments. Equipment repossessions. Loans stacked on top of loans. It was like watching a slow collapse in spreadsheet form. Then I found the personal expense reports. Grocery receipts. Utility bills. Prescription costs. Insurance premiums they could barely afford. There was nothing extravagant. No secret luxury spending, no hidden vacations. Just survival. I felt something uncomfortable stirring in my chest. Not forgiveness. Not even sympathy exactly. Just context. They really are broke, I said. Mateo nodded. Yes. That single word carried no judgment, no suggestion about what I should feel. Just confirmation. I moved on to the business records last, almost absently, until a familiar number jumped off the page. My social security number. I froze. It was listed on a credit application for equipment financing, heavy-duty compressors, roofing tools, materials. The applicant name wasn't mine, but the guarantor was. Charlotte Williams. Date: 2 months before my 17th birthday. My pulse started pounding in my ears. Mateo, I said, my voice sounding thin. He looked up immediately. What is it? I handed him the document without speaking. His expression tightened as he read. Then he pulled another file from the stack, flipping quickly through pages until he found what he was looking for. There are more, he said quietly. He laid them out side by side across the desk like cards in a grim game. Credit cards opened in my name. Personal loans. Lines of credit tied to the business. Retail financing accounts. Some with balances, some closed, some marked charged off. All of them opened when I was still in high school. I didn't sign these, I whispered, even though I already knew that wasn't the point. They likely signed on your behalf, he said carefully. Or had you sign without explaining? A memory surfaced, my dad bringing home paperwork late at night, telling me it was insurance stuff. My mom insisting I sign quickly because the accountant needed it the next morning. Me scribbling my name without reading because I trusted them. I felt nauseous. How much? I asked. Mateo scanned the totals. Over time? Tens of thousands. Possibly more if we include revolving credit. My stomach dropped. All those years I struggled with high interest rates, denied apartment applications, suspicious lenders asking extra questions. I thought it was just because I had no cosigner, no family backing, no credit history. I had a credit history. It just wasn't mine. They used me, I said slowly. Before they even kicked me out. Mateo didn't argue. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the timing. They had been building debt in my name while still telling me the business needed me to stay home and help. While framing my college plans as betrayal. They weren't planning for my future at all. They were borrowing it. Why didn't it destroy my credit completely? I asked. Some accounts were settled, others written off, he explained. Time also heals certain damage. By the time you started building your own credit, the worst of it may have aged out. Aged out. Like a wound that scars over without ever really healing underneath. I sat back in the chair, suddenly exhausted, like gravity had doubled. So they drained everything they could from me, I said, and now they want more. Mateo folded his hands. From a legal standpoint, this information significantly strengthens your position. I looked at him, almost laughing. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, he said honestly. But it may prevent a ruling against you. Prevent a ruling. Not restore trust. Not undo the past. Just stop further damage. I stared at the documents spread across the desk, proof of a betrayal I hadn't even known existed. Did they ever think about what would happen to me? I asked quietly. Trying to start life with all this hanging over me? Mateo didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because I already knew. They assumed I would come back. That I'd fail, run out of options, and return home grateful for whatever scraps they offered. The debt wouldn't matter if I never left. And when I didn't come back, they cut me off completely. It reframed everything. The silence. The blocked calls. The total erasure. I hadn't just disappointed them. I had become inconvenient. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to push back the wave of emotion threatening to spill over. Not sadness exactly. Not rage. Something heavier. Dirtier. Betrayal layered on top of abandonment. I don't even know what I feel right now, I admitted. That's normal, Mateo said gently. You're processing new information about people you thought you understood. Understood. That was generous. I had spent years simplifying them into villains because it was easier than wrestling with the complexity. Now they weren't just cruel. They were desperate. Flawed. Short-sighted. Capable of hurting me deeply while probably believing they were doing what they had to do. It didn't make it better. If anything, it made it worse. Because it meant there was no clean story. No obvious line between good and bad. Just a series of choices that snowballed into something ugly for everyone involved. I gathered the documents into a shaky pile. What happens now? I asked. Mateo closed the folder. Now we continue building your case. And them. They will do the same. Which meant more hearings. More statements. More opportunities for them to rewrite history in front of a judge while I sat there trying not to react. As I left the office that night, the sky over Phoenix was deep purple, the heat finally bleeding out of the air. For a moment I just stood in the parking lot, breathing, trying to steady myself. I had always believed the worst thing my parents did was kick me out. Now I knew that wasn't true. The worst thing was that they had been using me long before that, quietly, efficiently, without ever telling me the cost. And somehow, after all of it, they still believed I owed them.